Good morning, Miss Grace.
Good morning, Shai.
Look at your beautiful virtual, is that a virtual background?
Yes.
It's gorgeous.
Thank you. It's a virtual one.
So closing is today?
It should be. Yeah, I haven't heard about the closing the number, recording number, but they will get it today.
Oh,
and they bought the point, and their interest rate is 3%.
Wow, that's wonderful. Good.
He's very smart. I even didn't know until yesterday.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's hard. Otherwise it will be hard to get approval.
Yeah. Oh, but that's amazing.
Yeah, she's so blessed. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, of course, of course. I was so happy to know that it all worked out.
Yeah, no matter I have question, I always feel like you are the best person I can get advice. And thank you.
Oh, saying that. I love to help when I can.
Yeah, you're a big helper. Help a lot. Thank you.
So, do you have any fun plans in the next few months?
We choose a day, and probably Tracy, I, and Isabella, and my daughter and her husband, all of us will be move the big things to their new property, and end of April. And she still have some plan, so she has to stay in Seattle for a while. Yeah, she still have some business here, so she will travel back and forth. So it's good, I mean, she will live with us, during her stay in Seattle. It will be, we can see her more often than before.
Oh, that's awesome. How
And
is your sister?
I'm sorry?
How is Tracy doing?
She's doing great, thank you. She's doing great. She have some, some business partnership with her friend.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and we are planning for the birthday party, probably the first events in my daughter's property for my niece, for Tracy's daughter, Isabella.
Oh, how old is she?
12.
Oh, what a fun age.
Yeah, we are so excited. Yeah, we call them princess and the prince.
Oh, how fun.
Yeah, it's so much fun. A lot of work need to be done because the gutter and some furnace leakage, and they need to replace some the paper wallpaper or something.
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of work need to be done, but it will be fun.
Oh, that's great. I actually have to do that at my house. I didn't know until about 6 months after I moved in that our whole entry is wallpaper that was painted over. And it's just starting to like separate and peel. And we have like, I don't know, maybe 22-foot ceilings, 23-foot ceilings. And I'm like, no, I have to pay someone to do this. This is too much work.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna, I'll probably have that done in the next few months, but who paints over wallpaper? Oh,
if you don't like it, you have to pay it, right? It's not the quality, it's just the pattern.
Oh, well, here is Miss Michelle Riley. Can you hear us yet, Michelle? Nope, not yet. And Emily. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Shai.
How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
Good.
Good.
All right, we'll get started in just a minute. We have people joining on. Michelle, can you hear us? No. Vasily is joining. Quasey's here. Quasey, can you hear us?
It's actually Tanya.
Oh, hi, Tanya. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Well, I'm glad you could hear us.
Yeah.
All right, we'll wait one more minute as people are popping in. Miss Michelle, can you hear us now? Oh, you're muted. Oh, on a phone. Okay. All right, got a couple more coming in. So those of you that turn your cameras on get extra brownie points. Thank you. All right, so we'll get started. But if I am looking off for a minute, I'm letting people in that are in the waiting room. So feel free to unmute if you want. I would love to just check in and find out what you really want to make sure you get out of this class. Lizette, if you are talking, you're on mute.
Hi, I wasn't talking though.
Oh, I'm sorry, your little box lit up in yellow, so. All right, so I'll ask one more time. Is there anything specific you guys want to make sure you get out of this session? Or are you just coming because you don't get to hear me talk enough?
For me, one of the things is that I think will be great here. I mean, I only submitted a few offers, but everyone has waived inspection. So since I have no experience with that, on how to do it and how to negotiate, because it seems for a lot of people like it's a big, in this market, like nobody does it, it seems like anymore. So how to approach it and how to make sure
Great
that
question.
it's done properly.
Great question. So, and again, I'll say it one more time. You get extra brownie points for turning your camera on. Thanks, Connor. Thanks, Grace. So here's the thing. The reason, okay, you're good, Miss Michelle. The reason that I wanted to have this class is because there's definitely a shift happening in the market. And I don't have a crystal ball. However, about a week and a half ago, and the first day, it was like through half of Tuesday, so all of Monday and half of Tuesday, I got like 6 questions about inspections. So there is a shift going on in the market, and I'm hearing different pocket areas. There are still some areas that are going 150,000 overpriced, non-refundable earnest money, no inspection, all of that. But then there are areas where agents are getting inspection contingencies accepted. So as the market continues to shift, if interest rates continue to increase as we expect, we'll likely start seeing more home inspections. It's possible that we'll start seeing contingency accepted on offers. Like I have to sell my home before I can buy your home. So we go through this, and we always say in different markets, you need a different playbook. So all we're doing is kind of adding to your tools. So not only do you know what to do, but you can articulate it to your buyer or seller. Okay. So you guys know me well enough where you can just jump on in if you have questions. So I'm going to share my screen. We are going to go through all of the possible inspection forms, okay? And this isn't forms training. So we have everybody from all different levels. So I'm going to skip to certain sections of the different forms. And again, just to make sure you have a good understanding. So if you have questions, feel free to just jump on in. Okay, so this is a Form 35, which is your standard inspection contingency. Okay. Basically, what this says is, hey, seller, this buyer's offer will be contingent upon the satisfaction of a home inspection. In a nutshell, that's what it says. So a few things you need to know. The buyer's inspection may include, at the buyer's option and without limitation, structural, mechanical, general condition of the improvement to the property, compliance with building and zoning codes, an inspection of the property for hazardous material, pests, soil stability, and it has to be done by a licensed inspector or the buyer. So if Cousin Bob is a general contractor, Cousin Bob cannot do the home inspection. Okay, any questions on that? All right, perfect. Then we have paragraph 1A, and this is regarding a sewer scope, okay, where they go to the sewer clean out line, they put a camera in there, and it goes down to see if there's any roots or anything that may be penetrating any of the sewer lines. So I think you should recommend it to everyone, you know, within a certain age of a home. Okay, if it's a new construction home, you're probably fine because it's a newer sewer line. But like you can ask a home inspector. I usually tell people if there's a lot of trees around or if it was built before 1980. But it's worth a few $100s. Regardless of if your buyer is going to do a sewer scope, it is a best practice that you always check the box may. Even though it's a default box, I highly recommend you check it just because this was a lawsuit that we settled out of court, but there was a lawsuit regarding this issue. And the buyer claimed that our broker did not advise them to do a sewer scope. And luckily it got thrown out because the box was checked and we had a text message advising the buyer to get a sewer scope done. So remember, with an inspection, by law, you have to recommend the buyer to have a home inspection. All right, the buyer's obligation. Of course, the buyer selects the inspector. But what is important to note is the buyer shall be responsible for all damages from the result of an inspection. Okay, so not you are responsible, but the buyer is responsible. And that's an important piece that we will talk about when it comes to pre-inspections. A buyer's notice. So what is so important about an inspection contingency is there's a few different ways that it can be waived. Now, I know in the world that we live in right now, and frankly, in the last few years, it's not that big of a deal to have a waived inspection. But if you rewind our market a few years, it's a very, very big deal. It was a very big deal. And it could be a big deal down the road. So you have to understand the importance of it. If you miss a deadline and you represent the buyer, you waive their inspection contingency. That's a really, really big deal. That is, you're going to be paying someone's earnest money if you waive their inspection contingency. So what happens is the buyer has, let's say, 5 days to have a home inspection. Okay. Who can tell me how to compute that time? If we have 5 days, how do I compute it?
Business days.
Business days.
Business days. And if it's 6 days or more, it is
Calendar day.
perfect, calendar days. So this is one, if you ever have a question on, double check with 2 or 3 or 5 people, because if you miss it, you now waive it. A couple months ago, we had a broker send over the inspection response at 9:10 p.m. What does that mean on his deadline day?
After 9 p.m., it will be past
Correct.
due date.
After 9 p.m. Now, the broker was like, what do you mean? It was only 10 minutes late. But the listing broker's job is to represent their client, right? So if that listing broker said, oh, don't worry about it, I won't tell anybody, they're actually in conflict with agency law. And if you miss that deadline, buyer broker, you're not practicing reasonable skill and care, which is now in conflict with agency law. So you better know your time frames very clearly when it comes to an inspection. Any questions yet? All right. So buyer has, let's say, 5 days to not only conduct the inspection, but to respond to the inspection. Okay. And they basically have 4 options to respond. They can improve the inspection and say the inspection is satisfied. We waive the contingency. They can disapprove and terminate the agreement and get their earnest money back. They can conduct an additional inspection, which we'll talk about in a minute, or they can propose repairs or modifications. Okay. Now, this is what's most important about this. If you are asking for a price reduction, do not say, in lieu of these repairs, the new purchase price shall be X. The reason you don't want to do that is because that will raise a red flag to the underwriter. So you are not to talk about any repairs. And I know back in the day, that was our negotiation strategy. But you can't talk about repairs without disclosing information. So just say new purchase price shall be X. That's it, short and sweet. If you're asking for repairs, be specific as possible. Now, there are some brokers that think that if you're vague, it is to your advantage, but it's not. If there is a cracked window, you need to say the southwest window of the house needs to be replaced by a licensed and bonded contractor, window installer, however you want to say it. But you should always dictate licensed and bonded 100%. And do not say repair/replace unless you mean it, because everyone will always repair because it's cheaper. So on your response, being more specific will make all the difference in the world. Questions so far? Okay. Waiver. So we talked about before, if you miss your deadline, even by 10 minutes, buyer broker, you waive your inspection contingency. Another way to waive it, and this is very new, this is only a year and 1 month old, excuse me. If you send the listing broker the inspection report or a portion of the inspection report, you now waive the inspection contingency. This is new and this is big. If you copy and paste and try to do it on an email, that constitutes sharing and a waiver. So it's a really big deal. Do not share anything without the seller's consent, okay? There's a checkbox right here. And understand this box can be changed and it is not a counter offer, okay? Which means it can be checked. I'm a buyer. I send the offer to the seller. Seller signs it and they check a box. Buyer does not need to initial it, okay? It's not a counter offer issue. Additional inspection. So this is one of the buyer's 4 options when they're making their initial response, okay? When you need an additional inspection, you can provide the seller a copy of the inspector's recommendation and notice that you will seek an additional inspection. So remember, in real estate, when something is a notice, if I'm a buyer, it is my right to have an additional inspection. If Connor is my seller, Connor does not have to grant me permission for an additional inspection, okay? So everyone needs to understand that. Now, if I'm a buyer broker and Connor's the listing broker, I can't send the whole page of the inspection report. I need to send the section that says buyer recommends a roofing expert to check the life expectancy of the roof. That's it. One line, no pictures, no nothing, not the whole report, but you have to send the inspector's recommendation along with the Form 35R in order to give notice of that additional inspection. Any questions so far? All right, page 2. This talks about all of the buyer's requests for repairs and now the seller's response, okay? In an inspection contingency, the first 2 pieces are irrevocable, okay? What do I mean by that? That means, that means I'm the buyer and I make my initial response. And I'm going to actually go to that page just so it's a little bit easier. Okay, so this is a 35R. This is the inspection response, okay? This is the initial response by the buyer, okay? One of 4 things that I get to do as the buyer. The seller gets to respond with they agree to the modifications. They'll only correct the following modifications. They reject everything, or they reject it and propose something new. Now, these first 2 steps are irrevocable. So if I'm the buyer and I send the listing price shall be reduced by $10,000 to Connor, who's my listing agent, I can't revoke that and say, oh, sorry, Connor, I need that form back. I got to revise it. Even if I'm in my time frame, once I send it, it is irrevocable. Once Connor, the listing broker, sends it back to me, it is irrevocable. That's really powerful. The final response from the buyer, okay, you can go back and forth. But if buyer and seller are not in agreement by 9 o'clock of the final deadline, the buyer would waive their whole inspection contingency. So I'm going to give you a little example. I asked Connor to replace the roof. And Connor says, no, I'll give you $10,000 off the price of the house. Now the ball's in my court, the buyer, and I have 3 days unless otherwise agreed upon. And I'm calling Connor saying, hey, 10,000 is not enough. What about 20? And Connor says, no, I'll do 15. And we're going back and forth, right? And it's 8:45 at night on the final night. Now, as a buyer broker, I should have already had my buyer sign that they disapprove of the inspection and the earnest money will be refunded back. Because if I don't have a meeting of the minds by 9 o'clock, 100%, my buyer's inspection contingency will be waived. So that's really powerful. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Anyone have questions?
And all this negotiation needs to be done within 3 days, correct? All this back and forth?
Well, it all depends on what is, and I'm going to share my screen again. It all depends on the time frames in the contract. So the first time frame is the buyer's initial notice. So this is usually going to be 3 or 5 days. That means the buyer has, let's say 5 days, to not conduct their inspection and then to respond, okay? Once they respond, the seller then would have 3 days to respond, unless otherwise agreed upon. And then once seller does that, the buyer then has 3 days. Any other questions? All right.
Guy, I just want to clarify. When we present the buyer, we fill out this form and we have 5 days time frame to respond this contingency if we don't check, right?
Well, I mean, the default is 10 days, but
Okay.
yeah, but if you had a 5 written in here, it would be 5 days.
Okay, default 10 days, okay. So the seller will have 3 days to respond, right?
Correct.
So it counts continuously. If you back and forth, they always start with the very first day the buyer responds to the seller for that 10 days.
Yeah, so I'm gonna pull a calendar up really quick because I'd like to give you a little visual on this. Okay. So let's say, and I know we're at April 20th, but just to keep it in the middle of my calendar so it's easier to see. So let's say we get mutual on Monday the 11th, okay? And the buyer has 5 days to conduct the inspection and respond. If we have mutual on the 11th, this is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. That's very, very powerful for you to know if you're the listing broker. Because if I'm the listing broker, I'm cutting you off at 4 days. I am not waiting a whole extra weekend for you to respond. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's just say the buyer responds to the inspection early. And they respond Wednesday the 13th. Now the seller has 3 days. Day 1, day 2, day 3. Now the seller responds. Now the buyer has 3 days. day 1, day 2, day 3. So if there is not a meeting of the minds by, I say 8:45 p.m. on the 21st, you need to terminate the contract, or the buyer will waive their inspection contingency. And if this happens in a real life scenario, get our help before you get to that point. But you have to understand, if you're going back and forth, and this happens in a different type of market, if you're going back and forth, it could be a strategy on the listing broker's part. They could be like, oh, Connor, I'm going to get you an answer at 8:30. Okay, well, Connor better have that 35R pre-signed terminating the contract, unless his buyers are willing to risk having it waived. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Perfect. Any
Thank
other
you.
questions?
thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else? All right. When it comes to an inspection, repairs, the repairs have to be done in a professional manner. If you're me, I do not want my seller or the seller doing the repairs. I am going to dictate a licensed and bonded electrician. I am going to request copies of the receipt. When you ask for repairs, now we all know that within 5 days of closing, your buyer gets a final walkthrough. But a buyer can do a reinspection, but it has to be with the original inspector, and that's usually about $150. Okay. Now we're going to move on. If that box isn't checked here about the seller's consent, and this is a tough one for me. I get this asked all the time. Shai, will an email suffice? The listing broker says they want some of the inspection report. The seller's not available to sign. Can I just go based off of an email? I don't like that question because I don't know. I think it would probably be okay, but the MLS created a form for a reason. So I think it's important to have the form as much as possible. So the 35C is the seller's consent to receive the inspection report. This is if you're 5-7 days in, you're negotiating repairs, and the seller's like, I need to know more about this repair. Send me this page. So this is the form, the 35C. 35W. Now this is probably the form that you guys see most these days, okay? I love this form because it makes it very clear to the buyer that they are waiving their inspection or that they have conducted a pre-inspection, okay? So you can have an inspection contingency. You can waive an inspection. You can conduct a pre-inspection, which means, hey, seller, I would like to do an inspection on your home before you even accept my offer, thus giving me the opportunity to write an offer without an inspection contingency. So something to know about that is you would use a 35W when you are writing your offer. But in order to get permission to do the pre-inspection ahead of time, you need to get a 35P signed from both buyer, seller, and brokers. Why do you think this form is necessary? a 35P?
In case maybe during the inspection that there's damages to the property.
Yes, absolutely. If you're a listing broker, do you recommend for your sellers to have pre-inspections or not? Why not, Connor?
Because it opens up a can of worms in case that there are problems with the property and sellers become aware. Because if they become aware of any problems, then they have to disclose that.
Exactly. And that's the big one. Now remember, if we have mutual acceptance and then there's an inspection contingency, there's a little bit of recourse if the buyer breaches that contract. I don't think it's enough recourse to just waive the inspection contingency, but there's some substance to it. With a pre-inspection, there's no recourse if the buyer sends the seller the entire inspection report. Now, again, I don't believe it is our choice to make. I believe it's just the pros and the cons that we give the seller for allowing buyers to do pre-inspections. A seller might say, I'm totally fine with it. I don't have an issue. Modifications or repairs. A buyer, when making an offer, can ask right from Jump Street if there's repairs they want to be made. And then there is the on-site sewage system advisory, which we're not going to talk about septics today, but if there's a septic, use a septic form. So we talked a little bit about the 35P, okay, which is pre-inspection. We reviewed the 35R. So just a couple friendly reminders, okay? When you send these forms over, they need to go to the broker and the firm. Super important. If there's not enough space in this area, write C Form 34 and put it on an addendum. But be very careful. If you're doing your first couple of these, have Katie or myself or your mentor look over it, because there has to be a call to action, which I know sounds very silly, but let's say I just put broken window on the south side of the house. Well, technically, I didn't ask the seller to fix that broken window. I'm just stating there's a broken window. So there has to be a call to action. You should be very, very specific about the repairs and where they're located. You should ask for a licensed and bonded whomever, and you should ask for the receipt. So those are just good best practices, okay? If you're asking for or giving notice of an additional inspection, you shouldn't, let's say A and B need to be fixed, right? But we got to get the roof checked out. Well, you only give notice of the additional inspection regarding the roof with the recommendation from the inspector. And then when you respond to all of it, that's when you ask for A and B to be repaired or replaced. Seller's response, same type of thing. And then again, buyer's final response. Any questions so far? The last form we're going to talk about is a seller procured inspection report. Hold on, I've seen many listings that the seller is providing a pre-inspection report and giving copies to. Yes. This is, so out of everything that we're talking about, besides 35W and waiving the inspection, this is the most common, and this is not an MLS form, but a seller conducting an inspection, okay? Seller, not buyer, prior to going on the market, and then offering the inspection report to the buyer in hopes the buyer makes an offer without an inspection contingency. So number one, if I'm a listing broker, do I advise the seller to have an inspection or not? This is a trick question. I'm going to call on you. Dia, your thoughts?
As a listing broker, no, I would not recommend them having it because it puts them at liability, but I would say it's an option.
Very good diplomatic answer. Connor, your thoughts?
I would say kind of depends on the property. If it's, a property built in 1910, I definitely wouldn't recommend it. Because they're gonna have to disclose everything there. I do know from the buyer side of things, when considering offers, if there is a pre-inspection done for the property, that buyers are more willing to write stronger offers. They know exactly what they're buying and they're not buying blind, because if there isn't an inspection uploaded, at least in my case and talking with other people at open houses, people don't write as strong of offers. So if it is a house that's been updated and, then maybe there's some considerations to do one, but I would think just giving your sellers kind of the pros and cons and what can happen either way, and then ultimately letting them decide and make the option that's best for them.
Does anybody advise the seller to do it?
I would not advise doing an inspection.
So I'll say that this is, I don't know, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong, okay? I talk to a lot of attorneys and I've never met an attorney that would advise the seller to have an inspection prior to going on the market. However, I will say attorneys sit behind a desk and they deal with legal issues. They're not out selling houses. So what's most important is for you to give both buyer and seller pros and cons. So first we're going to talk about seller. And I completely agree with Thea that I do not advise a seller to get an inspection done prior to going on the market. That is not my advice. Seller, you have the option to do so. And here are the pros and the cons. Once you find out about that information, you have to disclose it, repair it, or refute it. So that's a big deal. Seller, you have to know what you're doing. Hold on 1 second. We just got a chat that I'm reading. Is there a JLS form they created to use if a buyer wants to use a seller pre-inspection? Yes, that's the form we're going to talk about. And I'm pointing, realizing you can't see my other screen. So seller has to understand whatever you find out, there's really no going back unless you're going to repair it, disclose it, or refute it. The pro of that seller is it's very possible that the buyer will waive their inspection. Now, let's switch gears and talk about if it's your buyer. Now, inspectors have different sets of eyes. In my opinion, inspector's eyes working for a seller is going to be very, very different than an inspector's eyes working for a buyer. So, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, understand that this inspection report may give you some information or it may be missing information. A few years ago, not one of ours, but our Kent broker, a top 1%er, okay, the best of the best, had the seller do it, a pre-inspection, and offered it to the buyer and verbally said, hey, buyer, we fixed all these things. You're good to go. Verbally. Well, come to find out, seller didn't fix a single thing. There was zero that the buyer could do. They had zero recourse. So as long as your buyer's okay, that's fine. In my opinion, having, if I represent a buyer, having the seller's inspection report is better than nothing. It is better than nothing. However, they have to understand there's no recourse, zero whatsoever, but it's some information versus no information. If you recommend or your seller does this, or you have a buyer, John L. Scott has a seller procured inspection report, okay? It's most important to use this if you're the listing agent, but I very much like it if you are the buyer broker. But it basically says in a nutshell, this whole house inspection report, you'd have to check that box, is an extension of the seller disclosure. That's it. We're not representing anything. This is what the inspector found. We're just pushing it on to you as a disclosure. And the buyer is acknowledging receipt. So very important to do that. I'm sorry, I forgot to share my screen. All right, so up here, you would check the box, whole house inspection. Seller is signing as an extension of the Form 17. Buyer acknowledges receipt. All right. Open for questions.
So this might be more of a Form 17 question, but if the sellers bought the house and had an inspection done, isn't there like a statute of limitations how long they have to disclose like certain aspects? Like if the old sellers reported that there was like a leak in the roof or even some other repairs, do they have to then disclose that on their Form 17? That's been like X amount of years.
So I don't know the statute of limitations because we're not lawyers. And even if I did, we wouldn't talk about it. But here's the general rule, okay? Is if you have direct knowledge of a material defect, okay? So the faucet in the kitchen has been leaking, okay? Now, seller could have repaired it 2 years ago, and it has withstood the test of time. Then you would not need to disclose that. But let's say that darn leaky faucet kept leaking over and over again throughout the years, and you kept fixing it, but something just happened where that faucet kept leaking. That is something you would disclose. You don't have to disclose if somebody told you. So I bought a house and the seller told me that the faucet leaked, but I never experienced the faucet leaking. I would not need to disclose that. Now, to throw a whole monkey wrench into all of this, you are not to ever advise a seller on what to disclose and what not to disclose. I speak from example when I'm advising my client, and I usually have a couple different stories. I always say, I've never been in a crawl space of any of the homes that I own. Never plan on going in a crawl space. But if my contractor tells me I have standing water and I don't repair it, I have to disclose that. And I also have the story of when I sold my house in Seattle. And I had done a ton of work on it, right? Massive remodel, knocking down walls, decks, electrical panels, the whole shebang. And I never got a permit. But I disclosed to the buyer that I didn't get a permit. So you should disclose material information that you have and don't investigate. Does that make sense? Got it. All right, other questions, thoughts, comments?
As long as you disclose, you don't, even in the future, you know, there are some, you know, because we don't have the permit, if something happened, you don't have the responsibility, right?
I wouldn't comment on your responsibility to like the city or the county, which I don't think there would be a responsibility, but there is no recourse for the buyer. If you were honest and you disclosed whatever, and that issue posed the problem, you have disclosed that. Quite a few years ago, I sold my brother a house on the Puyallup River, like his dream home. He could go fish every day. Well, his dream home turned into a bit of a nightmare because it started flooding 3 different times, 2.5. 2 times the entire house had to be rebuilt. And I never in a million years thought I could sell this house, but we sold it. Now it's my brother, okay? So this was not like a typical client. I had my brother and my sister-in-law write very in depth. They wrote like 4 or 5 pages in addition to the Form 17 about when it flooded, how high the water level was, all of the repairs that were done, because I wanted them to over disclose so no one could ever claim they didn't understand the severity of the flooding. Now, again, I over advised on that because it was my brother, but it's not our place to advise what to disclose and what not, but a lawyer will say when in doubt, disclose. Other thoughts, comments, concerns?
It's better over disclose instead of under disclose, right?
Yes, I agree. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had some very lovely neurotic sellers that will talk about, oh, you have to pour bleach down the sink in the summer, otherwise you get fruit flies. And I'm like, well, you don't really got to talk about that. It's not a material defect. So I try to, you know, I use that terminology because it's not what I don't like about the house. Is something broken? I have to disclose it. Do not investigate. If you don't find yourself frequenting your crawl space very often, you don't have to go down there to do your seller disclosure form. If you don't hang out in the attic, don't go up there when you're doing your Form 17. You know, it's not your job to investigate. And as a broker, because a lot of brokers have like construction backgrounds. No, not your job. Don't walk around and try to point out the rotted wood on the fascia board, or no, that's not your role. Be the broker. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you guys for coming. And like I said, if you start having inspections and that's happening again, come and talk to Katie and myself and we'll help you get through it. All right. Have a great day.
Thanks, Shai.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
See you soon.
Thank you.